Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. Here's a short list of some of the books that I think are worth reading. Think of this as a summer reading list, if you want to. I'm still reading one of these books, that'll be the first one that I talk about, but so far I've really enjoyed it. And the other four I think are wonderful. They're all really wonderful books. The first book is From Pinballs to Pixels by Ken Horowitz. This book covers the pinball and video game companies in Chicago. These companies have been very influential in the arcade industry for really decades, and I'm glad Ken brought their history together in this book. The four companies that he's talking about are Bally, Midway, Williams, and Gottlieb. They made a bunch of iconic games over the years. Mostly in the 90s when you start talking about Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam. But they also had hits like Qbert, they had Defender, they had a bunch of different games in the 80s as well. While Gottlieb is kind of left off of the subheading for this book, it still plays a pretty significant role, and he does talk about the company a little bit. I'm really glad that this book exists. I've read bits of the history of these companies over the years, and they're kind of spread out in multiple books. Some have been focused on one series of games, or they've been an autobiography, which one of those I'll talk about much later. Having these stories in one place is really excellent. At the time of me writing this and recording this video, I'm still reading this book. It's been terrific so far. I'm roughly about 100 pages into it, and I'm looking forward to seeing just how it all ends up, or at least how Ken ends the book. So, yeah, I kind of know how the history of these companies ends, but hey, it's fun to read something that somebody else has written. Ken has written several detailed books about Sega, and I'm glad that he has written about these companies, because they really did play a huge role in the arcades. GoldenEye 007 by Elise Noir was brought to us by Boss Fight Books, and it's one of those really great things that Boss Fight Books does, where they mix history along with personal stories about the games. This is a great book. Elise goes over the history of Rare, and specifically the development of GoldenEye for the N64. There was a lot of nostalgia in this book, and it brought up many memories of playing the game, specifically with my friends. I do not remember the single-player version, or the single-player campaign of GoldenEye whatsoever. I only ever remember playing the multiplayer. The story of GoldenEye's development is fascinating. It's described as a AAA game made like an indie game. The team was inexperienced, they made some mistakes along the way, but they were given the freedom to just try things and experiment, resulting in an excellent game. While it doesn't hold up as well today, it did create many of the things that would become standard in first-person shooters. Elise tells the story of this game and the other James Bond games as well. She gets into a lot of stuff in this book, and for me to kind of paraphrase it in just a few minutes doesn't really do it justice. It was also really nice to hear about the single-player campaign because, again, I must have played it, but I have no memory of doing so. I only really remember the multiplayer modes, but yeah, that is just one of those unique things about GoldenEye. A lot of people who had an N64 or had friends who had it remember playing this game. This is a really great book, and I enjoyed reading it an awful lot. And we go to another book from Boss Fight Books. This one was Minesweeper by Kyle Orland. This was a book that I wasn't expecting. Minesweeper is a simple game, and yeah, I wasn't really sure what to expect from it, especially when I looked at the length of the book and I was wondering, well, how could he really stretch the story of Minesweeper into this many pages? It was a simple game that was given away for free back in the 90s, and it might have been the first PC game that many people played due to it coming with Windows. I remember a little bit of Minesweeper, like just trying it out, trying to figure out what was going on, and then immediately quitting and going to the vastly superior Rattler race. In this book, Kyle gives the reader an extensive history of the game Minesweeper. It's one of those stories where you need to tell several other stories in order to get a complete picture of just what Minesweeper was, the impact that it had, and yeah, a lot of the other things that were associated with it. Some of the stuff that I even forgot to write down here, talking about the history of the games that preceded Minesweeper and how they could have inspired the game in some way. Also talking about the minor moral panic that cropped up around Minesweeper, which I found kind of ridiculous and reminded me of some people talking about play-to-earn games and a whole bunch of other weird stuff that goes into it. Each one of these stories is really fascinating, and you could write a book all on its own about that particular story. But in order to tell the history of Minesweeper, you need to touch on all of those different stories. The part of this book that I probably found the most interesting, because it just keeps getting stuck in my mind, is the high score community surrounding this game. It wasn't something that I expected to read, even in a book about Minesweeper, but it was really fascinating, especially seeing the problems that they ran into with tracking the high scores, verifying that somebody actually got the score that they say they did. It was just really cool. I liked that part of the book the most, especially since it led into like the clones and remakes of the game. This was really a book that I had no idea that I wanted. Minesweeper just seems to have a ton of history and a ton of stories attached to it. This was just a fascinating book to read, and I would highly recommend it to pretty much anybody who wanted to start reading about video games. Sid Meier's Memoir by Sid Meier. This was the first in a series of autobiographies about people in the video game industry that I've read in recent years. It seems like they started coming out just prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, and this book in particular was just amazing. I was really looking forward to this one right before it came out. His story is just really cool on its own right, but I was more interested in reading about the creation of Civilization, the creation of Sid Meier's Pirates, and a number of other games that Microprose created over the years, or at least published over the years. You learn a lot about Sid's life and his philosophy for making video games. This guy did not throw anything away, and would follow an idea to its end just to see if it could become a video game. And if he couldn't do it at the time, he would just put it back where he found it and then revisit it at some other point. Sid brings up revisiting ideas to see if they could be reworked into a game, and he talks about just how he had parts of games stuck on old computers that he just never threw out. It's kind of strange to hear that sort of thing, and now a lot of those game ideas are kind of trapped where they are, which is a little sad. His time at Microprose and really the founding and creation of that company make up a significant part of this book. Sid doesn't talk much about the business side of things because he wasn't really involved in that all that much. He was more focused on making games, which I can understand, but it would have been nice for him to say more about the business side, just because that's what I wanted. I wish there was more about that in this book, but if he didn't know, then he didn't know. Fire Access and making games for the home console are also brought up, which is a nice way to kind of segue into the second half of really his gaming career, where he was no longer tied to Microprose and he could just kind of do his own thing. If you were wondering why his name was added to many of the games that Microprose published, that answer is in here, and it's because his partner didn't think the game was going to sell, so they wanted to slap Sid Meier's name on there just so everybody knew that it was his fault. And it turned out to be a really great branding thing. It doesn't give you that much insight in the business side, like I said, which can be disappointing for some people, but overall, it's a really great book, and it tells you quite a bit about Sid's life and the games that he made. Creating Qbert by Warren Davis. This one was awesome. This is probably the best book on this list. Warren has lived a very interesting life. In this book, he talks about his career in the video game industry, and he also talks about his acting career. I wasn't expecting to learn about his acting career or know that he had an acting career, but it turned out to be one of the more fascinating parts of this book to see how he was balancing creating video games and also acting on the side. It was pretty cool to read about that, and it was also nice to read about how his acting kind of helped him out when he had to do certain things for video games, like really pioneering digitization into video games and that sort of stuff. Getting real footage of different parts, like different things, like flying through a forest or digitizing actors for FMV scenes. That stuff is in here too, and it's really fascinating to read about. Warren worked for several video game companies in the 80s, and I think he's best known for Qbert, but he also worked on many other arcade games. He did stuff for Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam. He worked on other things where he would create the technology that was used in order to create those games. And yeah, he did an awful lot for Midway when he eventually ended up there. There are plenty of other stories in this book. It was terrific when I started reading this, and when he started talking about the production side of things. That's when I got really excited to read this. While it was cool to read about how Qbert got made and everything, that's just a small part of this. And reading about how they would see different ideas, like seeing the Laserdisc games, and then try to replicate that in some way. It was just so cool to read about that, especially the process of actually making the movies and everything that would get turned into video games. I'm kind of rambling, but there was a lot of really awesome stuff in this book. This is one of the books that I'll recommend to anyone wanting to know more about arcade history. Warren provides many insights into how the games were made, and it's just a really fascinating book. I hope he writes another book about his career, or really anything else, because I loved reading this one, and I can't wait to see what he does next. I had to cut this list off at some point, so I figured I'd just stick to 5. While writing about these books, I kept thinking of other books that I would want to add to this list. And so, yeah, I came up with a handful of honorable mentions. Some of these are not released yet, so you can kind of look forward to seeing those and pick them up if you want. They are Day of the Tentacle by Bob Mackey, Animal Crossing by Kelsey Lewin, Doom Guy, which I'm super looking forward to, by John Romero, Not All Fairy Tales Have Happy Endings by Ken Williams, Imagine That by Ed Smith and Benji Edwards, Parappa the Rapper by Mike Scholas, Once Upon a Tauri by Howard Scott Warshaw, and Disrupting the Game by Reggie Fils-Aimé. So that was kind of my summer reading list, or my suggestions for a summer reading list for you guys. There are a few that I'm looking forward to reading. I've mentioned them in the honorable mentions and also at the beginning of this. But Doom Guy by John Romero is the one that I'm most looking forward to. There are many other books about id Software out there, but we don't have a first-hand account yet, and that's what I'm most looking forward to, seeing all of the stories that I've read before and getting John's take on those, or his perspective on them. There are many other books out there, and many more are being written, I'm sure. I'll keep an eye out for them, and as I get around to reading them, I'll post more reviews and lists like this as well. Let me know what some of your favorites are, and if you've read any of these, let me know what your thoughts on those are as well. I'll talk to you all later. Bye.